About 2 years ago, I reviewed the first book by Daniel Greene, Breach of Peace, and finally, I'm here with the sequel. And before we get any further, let me just smack. If you watch any of Daniel Greene's videos, you will know that that's a thing he does, so in honor of him. Before we get into the book, let's talk some background. My first thing always when I want to know something about a book is of course I go onto like Goodreads or Amazon reviews. But if we go onto Goodreads, thinking, oh, we'll find some reviews that help us out. There's also a lot of not. There's a lot of comments about woke, whatever people think that means. There's a lot of comments like just shitting on it for it being him, but also I do recall there was some controversy about who claimed the ownership of the book and all that. Like there were a lot of things that gone wrong, but I think the main reason it has a lot of negative is because it's written by a YouTuber, and that's kind of sad. So it actually stands at a 3.55 out of 5 based on 1,000 ratings and 250 reviews. So it's not as bad as you would fear. Before we get to how I felt when I read it, let's talk cover. The cover is fine. It sells the climax of the book really well, and it actually depicts the climax kind of in a stylistic way how I imagined it. It does one of the main characters pretty cool too, so I suppose that's pretty awesome. It isn't a man with a guy with a sword cover, because I dislike those, and I know that Green dislikes them too, so I'm glad that Felix Ortiz, who did this cover, and he did a wonderful job, it's a beautiful piece of artwork, that they didn't go with that. Still character front and center, but not guy with a sword. But here's the thing though, the cover is beautiful and all, I'm not a fan of it. It's not speaking to me. Like, I don't look at this cover and be like, I want to read that. I don't know, I honestly don't. And it's kind of sad. I guess all I can say is the cover's not bad, it's just not selling the book to me. Oh well, let's get to the first half of this book. The first 5 pages, basically the prologue, really sold me. They were so good. Like, oh Green, you made my skin crawl. Just the eeriness of like how Clit were being tortured. It was just perfect. And then you go on to a bold move. You make the main story take place like before the first book. Is this a prologue? Like, what's going on here? It's not bad. It's not as good as this book's prologue, but it's really weird reading a book where you know exactly where it's going in this way. Like, it was a bold move, and I can see the justification because we don't follow Chapman in the first book, we follow Chapman here. But when you know where his story is gonna go, it's really difficult to build any kind of momentum, any kind of make you care for him, because you know where he's gonna end up. So you know no matter what happens to him, like he's never in danger because you know where he's gonna end. So the tension, that's the word I was looking for, is gone. The biggest problem that I had with the previous book were the monsters. And they're in here, we get an explanation for how they exist and how they were created and who they are basically. Do I still like them? Not quite, I don't know. I honestly think they add too much to the story in a sense. I think the story is perfectly fine without these monsters, and then just make it more of a human story instead. Because we already have the Anointed who have basically superpowers. Now we also have monsters, and both are created by. Are they just called? Isn't it just called the Empire? I don't think it has a name. I think so. It doesn't say. But yeah, it basically just created by the Empire. And I don't know. I think they add too much, but maybe in the second half of the book it gets better. Something like that kind of irked me the wrong way were the romance in the first half here. Because you could tell Greene were actively going for it. And the way you can tell it when an author does it is when there's not spent enough time for them to get to know each other and build chemistry, like when it feels very high paced. And that's typically what you would see in a relatively short book. And if you're taking a book of, what's this, like 300-ish pages or so? Yeah, 340 pages or so. And you cut it in half to tell a prologue to your main story, you suddenly don't have a lot of time or space to write in a good romance. And that's really, really difficult, and I honestly think he bit over more than he could chew. But I think what I would do to fix this, I would have intermittent chapters in the main story, make the second part when we get to that, make that the entire book, and then maybe dedicate, let's say, 10 chapters, just to say a number, for telling Chapman's side of the first book. And in that way, you kind of pick highlights, and then you don't have to develop the romance the same way, because everybody understands time has passed. So it's okay for it to be a little rushed in some way, because you're not rushing it, you're just showing only the important parts for telling the important background story. And yeah, I don't know, that's probably what I would do. Or, because you don't have a lot of time, it's in my opinion, I don't write, but from what I've read, I would say it's been easier for an author to write good friendships with limited space than it is to write romance with limited space, because romance usually requires friendship already. The fell in love at first sight usually doesn't happen, doesn't work usually. So maybe just write them as friends. You can still get when, spoilers I suppose for both book 1 and this, Chapman dies. But you can still get the same reaction from Pirka. It can be her best friend. Maybe she was in love with him, but they never developed it. And you'll still get the perfect response you would need. Now, I have some negative things. I did say a lot of negative things, but honestly, it's not like it was a bad read. Like, I wasn't every time I was reading dreading like, oh, when's the next chapter, when's the next section, am I done yet? I wasn't feeling that way. It might sound like I'm very critical, but I'm only very critical because it's his second book and I want Greene to do the best he can. And I want to be honest about what I think. And I think, like, usually I talk about like peaks and valleys, like highs and lows of a story. And I think the problem for Greene is that his prologue is all the way up here. A lot of the story is just mediocre, and then the valleys that honestly aren't as bad as it seems. Well, as they aren't as bad as they sound, but they seem so much worse because you don't have those high peaks. I know people always say, oh, you want to even it out. Yeah, but you want to even it out so it's like, if this is your even, like let's follow the shelf here, then you want to go up, up. You don't want to go up, down, and then it averages out. You want to stay here with some tops. Of course, you will dip, but you want to keep it up as much as possible. But sadly, he more like just stays on the line at a perfect mediocre, and then has some, not even like I do this to show, but it's more like tiniest dips. That's kind of sad in my opinion, because he has an immense amount of talent. The world building is like, he's not reinventing the wheel in any shape or form in this book or the previous book, and probably not the next one. But what he's working with is solid, and he has the foundation for a solid third book that I would wish were at least, at a minimum, twice the thickness of this one. Because I think he needs that himself. He needs to give himself space. I think he played his hands. For his first book, I understand you want to go with a novella. It's simple and it's not that long. I think for the second one, he played it too safe, tried to play it too safe, and it actually came at a detriment. His style of writing and the world and story he wants to tell asks for a longer book. At least it doesn't ask for a half, like a novella again in half your novel book. Anyways, let's get to section 2. let's get to the second half. I was not a big fan of Holden in the beginning. I think he was boring compared to Clit, but as the story progressed, I started to like him more. And God, it sounds like I'm nagging on Greene so much. I'm honestly not. But the story is a little contrived. How the only reason that Holden gets the pistol and gets on the case and gets further in the story is by accidentally being put on the case. Like, it's all just a big accident. Or a big coincidence, I guess you could call it. But luckily, when you're reading the book, it actually, to me at least, it didn't feel that way. It was only when I sat down afterwards and writing down the script, writing down notes, like I'll read, let's say 50 pages or something like that, I'll read a part of the book until I feel like there's a natural pause in the story in a way, like, oh, we just had a climax, or we had a deep valley, and now we kind of evened out, maybe some action has happened, and then I reflect over what I read, because that's the easiest way for me to write down and remember. And when I sat down and I tried to think about it, I was like, this is very contrived. But then I realized while I was reading it, it didn't feel that way. I'm kind of torn. So I would say, don't think too much about that. I know I highlighted a lot, but that's how it is. Now, something I really liked was the chess interrogation scene. It's probably the best main story scene in the book. And I have seen some reviews calling it a bit of a League of Logic from the Anointed, I don't remember her name right now. How she interrogates him at chess, asking some questions, and then he's saying, like, the ex goes, oh, I play chess with my neighbor, and then she goes, have you seen your neighbor and we played a couple of days ago, and then later on in the game she goes, have you seen your neighbor lately? He's like, no, and then she goes, wow. Then maybe it was Holden, and then he kind of like did a reaction, and then she guessed, oh, I was right. And that's the thing, she's not pulling it out of her ass. The X was something magic for the Empire, which in the Empire was a huge deal. They are very important in the army, and she's a very high-ranking officer. Of course the army is keeping an eye on him because he is dangerous still. So of course they know that he used to date Holden. Of course he knew. And of course throughout the chess game she learned, oh, he's really good at chess, but then he starts making mistakes as she's asking towards Holden, and she's like, he's hiding something. And then he blunders some more, and then he talks about his neighbor trying to hide his blunders, but then you could argue that she makes a guess, I suppose. I suppose you could be like, well, she guessed that it must be Holden, and in a way I suppose you could say that's true. I would more say she did a logical thought. She did, of course, it's a guess, because if he hadn't reacted at all, then she didn't know. But the guess wasn't like pulled out of her ass. She wasn't like, oh, Holden's your ex, right? When did you see him last? Did you help him escape? No, it's more like, wait, you said you played with your neighbor a couple of days ago, but you haven't seen them in a while. And every time we talk about Holden, you suddenly start making mistakes in chess, even though for the first half of the game we established you were pretty good at chess. And we know Holden's your ex-boyfriend. So, did you help Holden? So, can you follow me? It's not that big of a leap of logic compared to what I have read people think it is. I just think people are trying to criticize it for not. I think it was great. I also think if you sat down and went through the chess moves, you'll probably have a decent chess match. I don't know how, knowing Greene from his videos, sadly. Greene, DM me. No, don't care. Knowing, from how Greene is in his videos, I could imagine that he probably sat down with his girlfriend or with a chess streamer or whatever, and actually, made out the game, wrote down, then does this, so that if you played the game, you would actually have a even game that at some point one of the sides blunders and the other side wins shortly after. Let's talk about the climax of the story. And I'm not gonna, how do I say it? I'm not gonna go into depth on what happened, because what I wanna say is it was done really, really well. Again, here Greene showed that he is a good author, because it had a great mixture of chaos and order. Like, it definitely felt like there was a plan and everybody were trying to execute it, but as with any great plan, there's always something that goes wrong, and something did on multiple occasions, and they dealt with it, and it felt chaotic, but in a way where you can be like, okay, we can follow the plan and we can see where it went wrong, we can see why it went wrong, and like, without perfect knowledge what happened. So I think it's really, really good. It's very balanced. Now, something else that, though, in the climax I didn't like, with the Anointed. Because I like the idea of, like, superhumans being able to withstand nearly anything in the world and all that stuff. But it's a bit too much. And I don't know if that's because we don't get their powers, because he hasn't explained them. Like, we are not explained how they're created. We know they're multiple because they all show up. And we know, like, one of them, she nearly, like, gets blown to smithereens and yet survives. And it's just, it feels a bit too much, especially because Clit is portrayed as now being this monster who can kill anything. And then, in a sense, you could say that it worked, because she felt like she was invincible, and then she got knocked down a peg, and I think that was the right thing. But I think with the very little information we have on the Anointed, they feel too strong now. I would rather want her to be more of a passive in the shadow. Of course, I still want Clit to not be a monster anymore, because I don't think they add enough, or they kind of add too much, you could say, and thereby loops around them being not enough. And it might just come down to execution. So the overall climax I liked. I don't like the Anointed, I don't like the monsters. Let's get to the conclusion. Should you read this book? Both yes and no, actually. I would say it's a decent read if you don't think too much. Like, if you don't care too much about the writing style, because the writing style is almost, I would say, Sanderson-esque, actually. It's not a flowing language. However, where the two then differ is that Sanderson, and it's unfair to compare him to Sanderson, but he's the best example I can think of. Sanderson does it expertly well. You can definitely tell that Greene is not an expert yet. He might become one day, but not yet. So you can definitely feel it's a bit clunky at times. Also, if you're the type of person who cares too much about tropes, like, oh, should at any point try and reinvent the wheel and not follow a trope too closely, I don't think this is a book for you either, because at times it does feel tropey. I think it's fine. I think tropes are there for a reason. I think if done really well, you can follow a trope like and still have a wonderful, perfect book. But if you care too much about it, no. Now, a more interesting question, for me at least, should you read the first book? So my first review, I said the book was really good and you should read it. Now, not really. I actually, because this book is basically 2 novellas and 1 setting up for a 3rd book, it kinda made the first book, like Reach of Peace, obsolete. Like, quite a lot. Because there's nothing in this book, in Breach of Peace, that Rebel's Creed isn't telling you in the first half. At least not, like, you get enough context in this one to skip the novella. The novella will just feel like, oh, that's the side story to this one. Even though I think you could, technically, this one's first novella storyline thingy is the side story to this one. So, I would say, go for this one and only read this one, like the Breach of Peace, if you really like this book. All in all, this is not a bad book. Not at all. I have my criticisms. You can tell Greene has improved, and you can tell that it's like he's doing his best, and I think the 3rd book is going to be even better. And he's coming out with a science fiction book like Neon Ghost. here's the cover for that one, and there's a link to his Kickstarter in the description if you want it or are interested. I am getting it. Yeah, that was my review of Rebels 3. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe.